The drawing-room at Ashford House had never been so silent. Edward Ashford, Viscount Langley, stood before the tall windows overlooking the manicured gardens of his Hertfordshire estate, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. The late afternoon light filtered through the glass in muted gold, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs and mahogany furniture that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. He was a man of 32 years, tall and impeccably dressed, his dark hair meticulously combed, his cravat tied with mathematical precision. Everything about him spoke of control, of order, of a life lived according to the strictest principles of duty and propriety. And yet, at this moment, control seemed a distant concept. Behind him, seated in the chair she always occupied during their afternoon hours together, was his wife, Lady Catherine Ashford. She had been Catherine Bellingham before their marriage 3 years prior, the eldest daughter of a baron whose estates bordered his own, a woman of quiet beauty and impeccable breeding. Their union had been arranged, as was customary, a merging of lands and titles that pleased both families immensely. Edward had entered the marriage with a sense of satisfaction, believing he had secured precisely what a man of his station required, a wife of good birth, modest demeanour, and suitable accomplishments. Catherine had never complained. She had never raised her voice. She had moved through the halls of Ashford House, like a whisper, attending to her duties with flawless efficiency. She managed the household, received guests with grace, and sat beside him at dinner parties where she spoke only when addressed, her responses always measured and appropriate. London society regarded her as the perfect viscountess, demure, elegant, nearly invisible, except as an ornament to her husband's reputation. Edward had believed himself content. He did not love her, of course. Love was not a requirement of marriage among people of their class. He respected her, in the distant way one might respect a piece of fine furniture that performed its function without fuss. He provided for her generously, ensured she wanted for nothing, and expected in return only that she continue to be exactly what she had always been, quiet, dutiful, and undemanding. This afternoon, however, something had shifted. "I have given this considerable thought," Catherine said, her voice so soft that Edward had to strain slightly to hear her, though the room was utterly still. "And I believe it would be best if we discussed the possibility of separate arrangements." Edward turned slowly, his expression carefully neutral. Catherine sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect as always. She wore a gown of pale blue muslin, her dark blonde hair arranged simply at the nape of her neck. Her face, which he realized with some surprise he had not truly looked at in months, perhaps longer, was composed but pale. Her grey eyes, usually downcast, were fixed somewhere near the fireplace, not quite meeting his gaze. "Separate arrangements," Edward repeated, his tone measured. "I confess I do not understand your meaning." Catherine's fingers tightened slightly in her lap, the only visible sign of tension. "I believe you understand perfectly well, my lord. I am suggesting that we might live apart. You could remain here, or in London as you prefer. I could retire to the Dower House, or perhaps to my mother's estate, in Kent." The words hung in the air like smoke. Edward felt something cold settle in his chest, though he could not have named what it was. Not anger, precisely, not hurt, certainly. One could only be hurt by someone whose opinion mattered, and Catherine's inner thoughts had never seemed particularly relevant to him. But there was something, a disturbance, a crack in the perfect edifice of his carefully ordered life. "That is quite impossible," he said, his voice taking on the tone he used when, addressing tenants or servants, firm, final, brooking no argument. "We are married, Catherine. Our positions in society, our families, our very names are intertwined. What you suggest is not only impractical, but would invite scandal of the most damaging sort." "I am aware of the difficulties," Catherine replied, still not looking at him, "but I believe, with discretion, it could be managed. We would not divorce, of course, merely live separately. Many couples of our acquaintance have such arrangements. Those couples," Edward said coldly, "are typically driven to such extremes by infidelity or profound incompatibility. We have neither. You have no cause for complaint. I have provided you with everything a woman in your position could possibly require." For the first time, Catherine's eyes lifted to meet his. There was something in them he had never seen before, or perhaps had never bothered to notice. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of quiet resolve that made him inexplicably uneasy. "You have provided me with everything," she agreed softly, "except a reason to remain." The words struck him with unexpected force. Edward prided himself on his rationality, his ability to approach every situation with logic and clear thinking. But in this moment he found himself at a loss. He had done everything correctly. He had married appropriately, maintained his estates, fulfilled his duties as a husband and a peer of the realm. How dare she suggest it was not enough? "You are being absurd," he said, though even to his own ears the words sounded uncertain. "What could you possibly lack? You have a beautiful home, security, position—" "I lack," Catherine interrupted gently, and the interruption itself was so unprecedented that Edward fell silent. "A husband who sees me as anything more than a particularly useful piece of furniture." The accusation hung between them. Edward felt his jaw tighten. "I have always treated you with respect." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "You have been unfailingly polite. You have never once been cruel or raised your voice, or treated me with anything but the most proper consideration." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was almost inaudible. "But you have also never once looked at me as though I were real." Edward turned back to the window, uncomfortable with the direction of this conversation. "I do not understand what you want from me, Catherine. I am not a man given to excessive displays of sentiment. You knew this when we married." "I knew nothing when we married," Catherine said, with more force than he had ever heard from her. "I was 20 years old. I knew only what I had been told, that I should be grateful to secure such an advantageous match, that I should consider myself fortunate to become Lady Langley, that my happiness was of secondary importance to my family's interests." "And has that not proven true?" Edward asked, still facing away from her. "Have you not benefited from this union?" There was a long silence. When Catherine finally spoke, her voice had returned to its usual quietness, but there was something beneath it now, something that made Edward's chest feel strangely tight. "I have learned," she said slowly, "that there are worse things than poverty or obscurity. I have learned that it is possible to live in a beautiful house, wear fine clothes, want for nothing material, and still feel as though one is slowly disappearing. I have learned that being treated with perfect courtesy by someone who fundamentally does not care whether you exist or not is its own particular form of cruelty." Edward's hands, still clasped behind his back, tightened until his knuckles ached. "You are overwrought." "I am perfectly calm," Catherine replied. "Perhaps for the first time in 3 years I am thinking clearly." She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts with movements so habitual they seemed automatic. "I do not ask for your affection, Edward. I long ago accepted that you would never provide it. I ask only for my freedom, or as much freedom as is possible within the constraints of our situation. I wish to live quietly, away from this house, away from London, away from the constant reminder of my own insignificance." Edward finally turned to face her fully. She stood in the center of the room, small and composed, her hands folded before her. She looked exactly as she always had, unremarkable, proper, easily overlooked, and yet something about her seemed different. Now, as though by speaking these words, she had somehow become more solid, more present, more real than she had been mere moments ago. "I will not permit it," he said flatly. "You are my wife. Your place is here." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "Then I shall remain," she said quietly. "But I shall no longer pretend that this is anything other than what it is, a business arrangement, a social convenience, a performance for the benefit of others." She moved toward the door, her steps soundless on the thick carpets. "I shall continue to fulfill my duties as your hostess and the mistress of your household, but I shall no longer harbor any illusions about what our marriage truly is or could ever be." She paused at the threshold, her hand on the doorframe. For a moment Edward thought she might say something more, but she simply left, closing the door behind her with the softest of clicks. Edward stood alone in the drawing room as the afternoon light faded into evening. The house was utterly silent. Somewhere far off, he could hear the faint sounds of servants moving about their duties, the distant clatter of preparations for dinner. But in this room, there was nothing. He should have felt relief. The conversation was over. Catherine would remain. Life would continue as it always had. Order would be maintained. Instead, he felt the strangest sensation, as though something precious had just walked out of the room, and he had not possessed sufficient wit to recognize its value. Until the door had already closed, he dismissed the feeling immediately. Sentiment was a weakness. Emotion clouded judgment. He had lived his entire life according to principles of reason and duty, and he would not deviate from that path now, simply because his wife had suffered a temporary bout of melancholy. By morning she would have forgotten this entire unfortunate conversation. Everything would return to normal. It had to, because the alternative, the possibility that Catherine might actually mean what she had said, that she might actually be prepared to live the remainder of her life as a ghost in his house, was something Edward found he could not quite bear to examine too closely. The summer Edward Ashford was 16 years old. His father summoned him to the library at Ashford House and informed him with characteristic brevity that he would be sent to Oxford in the autumn to begin his education as befitted the heir to the viscountcy. "You will distinguish yourself in your studies," the late Lord Langley had said, seated behind the massive oak desk that seemed to dwarf everything else in the room. "You will form appropriate connections with other young men of quality. You will conduct yourself at all times with the dignity appropriate to your station, and you will, above all else, avoid the sort of foolish entanglements that distract young men from their true purposes." Edward, standing at attention before his father, like a soldier before a commanding officer, had nodded. "Yes, sir." "Your mother," the elder Lord Langley had continued, his voice taking on a tone that Edward had learned to recognize as barely contained disgust, was afflicted with an excess of sentiment. She believed that marriage should involve affection, tenderness, all manner of romantic nonsense. Such beliefs led only to her unhappiness and my inconvenience. Edward's mother had died when he was 7 years old. He retained only the vaguest memories of her. The scent of lavender, the softness of her voice when she read to him in the nursery, the way she had sometimes looked at his father with an expression Edward had been too young to interpret. After her death, his father had never remarried, had never spoken of her, except in these occasional pronouncements about the dangers of emotion. "A man of our class," his father had said, fixing Edward with a penetrating stare, "marries for duty, for the continuation of the family line, for the consolidation of property and position. He does not marry for love. Love is the affliction of poets and fools. It clouds the judgment, weakens the will, and leads to decisions that benefit no one. Do you understand me, Edward?" "Yes, sir," Edward had replied, though he had not truly understood, not then. He had been 16, with only the haziest notions of what marriage might entail beyond the formal ceremonies he had witnessed and the distant, cold partnership his parents had exemplified. "Good," his father had said, dismissing him with a wave. "See that you remember it." Edward had remembered. Through his years at Oxford, through his subsequent years in London, through the entire process of selecting Catherine Bellingham as his bride, he had remembered. Duty over feeling, reason over sentiment, control over passion. It had served him well. He had never made a fool of himself over a woman. He had never been distracted from his responsibilities by the sort of romantic entanglements that seemed to plague his peers. He had approached his marriage with the same careful calculation he brought to the management of his estates, and the result had been, by all objective measures, successful, until 3 days ago, when Catherine had asked him for her freedom. Now, standing in the same library where his father had delivered that long-ago lecture, Edward found himself troubled by thoughts he could not quite organize into coherent patterns. Catherine had not appeared at dinner the evening of their conversation. She had sent word through her lady's maid that she was unwell and would take her meal in her rooms. The following day, she had emerged only briefly, moving through the house like a silent shadow, speaking to no one except the housekeeper regarding some trivial domestic matter. Edward had told himself he was relieved. The awkwardness of their last exchange could fade into the past. Life could resume its normal course. But life had not resumed its normal course. Instead, Edward found himself noticing things he had never noticed before. He noticed, for instance, that when Catherine did appear in the drawing-room that afternoon, she brought with her a book, a novel, it appeared, and settled into her usual chair with every appearance of intending to read it. This was unremarkable in itself. Ladies often occupied themselves with reading, but Edward realized with a faint sense of unease that he could not recall ever having seen Catherine read before. He must have seen it, surely. She read, but he could not produce a single specific memory of her doing so. What did she read? What interested her? Did she prefer poetry or prose, philosophy or romance? He had no idea. He noticed that when Mrs. Holbrook, the housekeeper, came to discuss the week's menus, Catherine's responses were brief but contained suggestions Edward had never heard her make before. She preferred, it seemed, lighter fare during the summer months. She thought the fish course might be served cold rather than hot. She wondered if the cook might prepare a particular type of tart she remembered from her childhood in Kent. These were small matters, trivial details of household management. Yet Edward found himself struck by the realization that Catherine had preferences, opinions, memories of a life before she had become Lady Langley. She was not simply the quiet figure who appeared at his table and sat in his drawing room. She had a history, a set of experiences and inclinations that existed entirely, independently of him. Why had he never considered this before? On the fourth day after their conversation, Edward came upon Catherine in the gardens. She was walking along the gravel path that led to the small ornamental lake at the far edge of the grounds, her parasol tilted to shade her face from the morning sun. He had been returning from a ride on the estate, inspecting some repairs to one of the tenant cottages, and had decided to walk his horse back to the stables rather than ride. He was some distance behind her, far enough that she did not appear to have noticed his presence, and so, for reasons he did not examine, Edward simply followed, watching. Catherine moved slowly, pausing occasionally to observe some flower or shrub. At one point, she knelt, careless of her pale muslin gown, to examine something in the grass. A beetle, Edward realized, as he drew close enough to see. She watched it with what appeared to be genuine interest as it made its laborious way across a stone, then carefully moved a fallen leaf from its path before rising and continuing her walk. It was such a small gesture, entirely insignificant, the sort of thing Edward would never have noticed under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, and Edward found himself arrested by the sight of his wife alone in the garden, performing this tiny act of consideration for a creature too insignificant to merit anyone's attention. When had he last performed a single act of consideration for Catherine herself? The thought came unbidden, unwelcome. Edward pushed it aside immediately. He had performed countless acts of consideration. He had married her, given her his name, provided her with everything she could possibly need. What more could reasonably be expected? But the question lingered, troublesome and persistent. Catherine reached the lake and stood at its edge, gazing out across the still water. From Edward's vantage point, some 20 yards distant, partially concealed by an ornamental hedge, he could see her profile. She had removed her gloves and was holding them loosely in one hand. Her expression was difficult to read at this distance, but there was something about her posture, the slight slump of her shoulders, the way her head tilted forward just slightly, that suggested a weariness Edward had never associated with her before. She looked, he realized with uncomfortable clarity, profoundly alone. A memory surfaced, unexpected and vivid. Their wedding day, 3 years prior. The ceremony at the church in the village near her father's estate, Catherine in her bridal gown, standing beside him as they spoke their vows. He had been thinking about the property settlements, about the excellent connection the marriage represented, about the satisfaction of having secured his future in such an advantageous manner. He had not, he realized now, looked at Catherine's face even once during the entire ceremony. What had she been thinking, standing beside him as she pledged her life to a man who regarded her as a particularly favorable business transaction? Edward became aware that his hands were clenched around his horse's reins with sufficient force to make the animal shift restlessly. He forced himself to relax his grip, to breathe steadily, to reassert control over the unwelcome rush of something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. He had done nothing wrong. He had behaved exactly as a man of his station was expected to behave. Catherine had entered the marriage with full knowledge of its nature. If she had harbored romantic expectations, that was her own foolishness, not his failure. And yet, As he watched her standing alone by the water, Edward felt something twist in his chest. It was not love. He would not dignify it with such a name. Love was the sort of dangerous delusion his father had warned him against. But it was something. Recognition, perhaps. The uncomfortable awareness that Catherine was not merely a role to be filled, but a person who apparently spent her mornings rescuing insects and her afternoons reading books and her evenings eating alone in her rooms because the thought of sitting across from her husband at dinner had become unbearable. Catherine turned suddenly, as though sensing his presence. Edward froze, certain she would see him lurking behind the hedge like some sort of voyeur, but her gaze swept past him without pausing, and after a moment she began walking back toward the house, her steps slow and measured. Edward remained motionless until she had disappeared from view. Then, leading his horse, he took a different path back to the stables, unwilling to risk another encounter. That evening, Catherine appeared at dinner. She wore a gown of soft dove grey, her hair arranged simply. She took her seat across from Edward with her usual composure and proceeded to eat in silence, responding to his occasional remarks about estate business with monosyllabic replies that provided no opening for further conversation. Edward found himself studying her covertly between courses. The candlelight softened her features, casting shadows that made her face more interesting than he had previously thought it. She was not beautiful in the fashionable sense. Her features were too regular, her coloring too muted, her manner too subdued to attract notice in a crowded ballroom. But there was something almost haunting in the quietness of her, in the way she seemed to exist at a slight remove from everything around her, as though she were not quite fully present, or as though she had learned to make herself absent, because presence brought only pain. The thought struck Edward with disturbing force. He set down his wine-glass rather more heavily than intended, causing Catherine to glance up briefly before returning her attention to her plate. "I trust you are feeling better," Edward said, his voice sounding stiff even to his own ears. "You were unwell earlier in the week." "I am quite recovered, thank you," Catherine replied, not meeting his eyes. "Good," Edward said. "That is good." Silence descended again. Edward searched for something else to say, some topic that might provoke more than the briefest response. But his mind, usually so orderly and efficient, seemed to have emptied of all useful thoughts. Finally, in desperation, he said, "I noticed you have taken to walking in the gardens in the mornings." Catherine's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She lowered it. Slowly, her expression unreadable. "I hope my presence there does not disturb you, my lord." "Not at all," Edward said quickly. "I merely observed that you seem to enjoy it." "I do," Catherine replied quietly. "The gardens are very beautiful at that hour." "Peaceful." "Yes," Edward agreed, though he could not recall the last time he had walked in the gardens for pleasure rather than to inspect the gardener's work. "They are." Another silence. Edward felt a growing sense of frustration, though, whether with Catherine for being so uncommunicative or with himself for being so inept at simple conversation, he could not have said. "Catherine," he began, then stopped, uncertain of what he intended to say. She looked at him fully then, for the first time since entering the dining room. Her grey eyes held a question, a wariness, and something else he could not quite identify. "Yes, my lord?" The formal address grated on him suddenly. They were married. They shared a name, a home, a life. Such as it was. Yet she addressed him as though he were a stranger, someone to whom she owed deference but not intimacy. Had he ever given her reason to do otherwise? Edward faltered, words deserting him entirely. What could he possibly say? "I saw you in the garden and realized I know nothing about you. I have been thinking about our conversation and find myself disturbed by it in ways I cannot articulate. I am beginning to suspect that I have made a grave error, though I cannot yet name what." "It is?" "Never mind," he said finally. It was nothing of consequence. Something flickered across Catherine's face. Disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. She nodded slightly and returned her attention to her meal. They finished dinner in silence. Catherine excused herself immediately after, leaving Edward alone with his port and his increasingly uncomfortable thoughts. In the library later that evening, Edward found himself standing before the portrait of his mother that hung above the fireplace. It had been painted when she was young, shortly after her marriage to his father. She looked happy in the portrait, or at least as happy as the formal style of the painting allowed. There was a softness to her expression, a hopefulness that Edward had never seen in his father's face. His father had said she was made unhappy by her romantic expectations, that her belief in affection and tenderness had led to disappointment. But what if, Edward found himself thinking, the disappointment itself was what had caused the unhappiness? What if his mother had not been foolish for hoping for more, but his father had been cruel for refusing to provide it? The thought was disloyal. Worse, it was dangerous. It suggested that the principles Edward had built his entire adult life upon might be fundamentally flawed. He pushed it away, turned from the portrait, poured himself another glass of brandy he did not particularly want. Upstairs, in her rooms, Catherine was presumably preparing for bed. Tomorrow she would rise early and walk in the gardens. She would eat her meals in silence. She would move through his house like a ghost, performing her duties with perfect efficiency and no visible emotion whatsoever. And Edward, who had always prided himself on his ability to solve any problem through the application of logic and careful planning, had absolutely no idea what to do about any of it, except that he knew, with growing certainty, that he could not continue as they had been. Something had shifted. Catherine had opened a door with her quiet request for freedom, and Edward found he could not close it again, no matter how uncomfortable the view beyond it might be. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a footman in the distinctive livery of the Duke of Rothbury. Edward was in his study, reviewing the accounts from his steward, when the butler brought the heavy cream envelope on a silver tray. "From His Grace," the butler intoned, setting the tray on Edward's desk with the gravity appropriate to ducal correspondence. Edward broke the seal and scanned the contents. The Duke and Duchess of Rothbury requested the pleasure of Viscount and Lady Langley's company at a house party to be held at Rothbury Park in Surrey, commencing Friday next and continuing through the following week. There would be shooting for the gentlemen, various amusements for the ladies, a ball on the Saturday evening, and the opportunity to enjoy the society of several distinguished families of their acquaintance. It was precisely the sort of invitation Edward typically accepted without hesitation. The Duke of Rothbury was an influential man whose good opinion was worth cultivating. The guest list would undoubtedly include others whose connections might prove valuable. It was an opportunity to be seen, to reinforce his position within the complex social hierarchy of the aristocracy. Edward's first instinct was to pen an acceptance immediately. His second was to wonder whether Catherine would be willing to accompany him. They had not spoken at any length since the dinner, when he had noticed her walking in the gardens. 2 weeks had passed in a state of careful, formal distance. Catherine continued to fulfill her duties as mistress of the household. She appeared at meals when required. She received the vicar's wife when that lady called to discuss the parish charity. She did everything that was expected of her, but the quality of her presence had changed in some fundamental way. She was there but not there. She moved through each day like someone performing a role in a play they had long since grown tired of. Edward found it profoundly unsettling. He also found, to his surprise, that he missed something. Not conversation precisely, they had never truly conversed, but there had been a kind of comfortable routine to their previous existence, a predictability that had allowed Edward to believe all was well. Now he could not sustain that belief. Now he was constantly aware of Catherine's absence, even when she was physically present. Now he caught himself thinking about her at odd moments, wondering what she was doing, whether she was in the gardens again, what book she might be reading, whether she ever thought of him at all. It was remarkably inconvenient. Nevertheless, protocol demanded that he inform his wife of the invitation and allow her to prepare for their attendance. Edward left his study and went in search of Catherine, finally locating her in the morning room, where she sat at her writing desk attending to correspondence. She looked up as he entered, her expression politely attentive but carefully neutral. "My lord." "An invitation has arrived," Edward said, holding out the letter, "from the Duke of Rothbury, a house party at his estate, beginning Friday. I trust you will be able to ready yourself in time." Catherine took the letter and read it, her face giving away nothing of her thoughts. When she finished, she folded it carefully and handed it back to him. "Of course, my lord. I shall have my maid begin preparations immediately." "Excellent," Edward said, though he felt oddly dissatisfied with this exchange. "I believe the Rothburys have recently returned from an extended stay in Italy. The Duchess is said to be in excellent spirits." "How pleasant for her," Catherine murmured, already returning her attention to her correspondence. Edward lingered in the doorway, feeling uncharacteristically uncertain. "Catherine." She looked up again, a faint questioning in her expression. Edward searched for words, feeling absurdly awkward. "I trust you will find the party agreeable. The Duchess is known for her excellent taste in arranging entertainments." "I am certain it will be most agreeable," Catherine replied with perfect courtesy and not a trace of genuine feeling. Edward nodded and left, thoroughly dissatisfied, but unable to articulate precisely why. The journey to Rothbury Park took the better part of a day. Catherine sat across from Edward in the carriage, a book open in her lap, her eyes fixed on the pages in a manner that strongly suggested she was not actually reading. Edward made several attempts at conversation, all of which were met with brief, polite responses that effectively discouraged further discussion. By the time they arrived at the grand Palladian mansion that was the Duke of Rothbury's principal seat, Edward was in a state of considerable irritation, though whether with Catherine for being so uncommunicative or with himself for caring, he could not determine. Their reception was everything that might be expected. The Duchess, a handsome woman in her 40s with an air of confident sophistication, greeted them warmly in the marble entrance hall. The Duke, slightly older and possessed of the sort of assured authority that came from generations of unquestioned privilege, shook Edward's hand with genuine pleasure. "Delighted you could join us, Langley," the Duke said. "And Lady Langley, what a pleasure. We have several other guests already arrived. You must allow me to introduce you." The drawing room was filled with perhaps 20 people, all members of the same elevated social circle. Edward recognized most of them: Lord and Lady Hartwick, Sir William and Lady Caroline Preston, the elderly Dowager Countess of Pemberton, and various others of similar rank and consequence. And standing near the windows, engaged in animated conversation with Lady Caroline Preston, there was Captain James Thornton. Edward felt something cold and sharp lodge itself beneath his ribs. Captain Thornton was the second son of the Earl of Westbrook, a man of perhaps 28 years, who had distinguished himself in military service before inheriting a comfortable independence from a maternal uncle. He was tall, fair-haired, possessed of an easy charm that made him welcome in any company. Edward had made his acquaintance in London some years ago, and had always found him pleasant enough if perhaps overly inclined toward levity. More importantly, Captain Thornton had, prior to Edward's engagement, shown considerable attention to Catherine Bellingham during her brief season in London. Edward had known this, of course. Catherine's father had mentioned it during the marriage negotiations, noting with evident satisfaction that his daughter had attracted the notice of an earl's son before securing the even more advantageous match with a viscount. Edward had given the matter no thought at the time. What did it matter if some captain had danced with Catherine at a few balls? She had married Edward. The matter was settled. Now, watching as the Duchess led them across the drawing-room, and Captain Thornton turned, his face lighting with unmistakable pleasure as his eyes fell upon Catherine, Edward found that it mattered very much indeed. "Lady Langley," the captain said, bowing over Catherine's hand with rather more attention than Edward felt was strictly necessary. "What an unexpected delight. I had no idea you would be among the party." For the first time in weeks, Catherine smiled. It was a small smile, cautious and brief, but it transformed her face entirely. Edward felt something twist violently in his chest. "Captain Thornton," Catherine said quietly, "I am equally surprised. I had heard you were in Scotland. I was until recently. Business brought me back south, and I was fortunate enough to encounter the Duke in London. He was kind enough to extend an invitation." The captain's eyes remained fixed on Catherine's face with an intensity that made Edward's jaw tighten. "You are looking very well indeed. The country air clearly agrees with you." "You are too kind," Catherine murmured, a faint colour rising in her cheeks. Edward found himself stepping closer to his wife, close enough that his presence could not be ignored. "Captain Thornton and I are acquainted," he said, his voice coming out rather colder than he had intended. "Though I was not aware you shared the same distinction, Catherine." Catherine glanced at him, something unreadable flickering in her expression. "Captain Thornton was kind enough to stand up with me at several assemblies during my season in London, my lord," before our engagement. Merely several, the captain said with a laugh that Edward found intensely irritating. I believe it was considerably more than that. You were the only young lady willing to discuss something more interesting than the weather or the latest fashions. I remember we had a most engaging conversation about Wordsworth's poetry at Lady Pemberton's ball. Catherine's smile returned, slightly warmer this time. I had forgotten. You were very patient with my opinions, even when they were rather naive. Your opinions were never naive, Captain Thornton said earnestly. Merely unpopular. I found them refreshingly honest. Edward felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. The conversation was perfectly proper. There was nothing in the captain's manner that could be objected to on grounds of impropriety. Yet Edward found himself seized by an almost overwhelming urge to plant his fist in the younger man's face. The Duchess, with the impeccable social instincts of her class, appeared beside them. Captain Thornton, I believe Lady Caroline was hoping you might join her and the Dowager Countess for tea in the conservatory. Some question about the plantings you saw in Scotland. Of course, the captain said, though his eyes lingered on Catherine for a moment longer. Lady Langley, I hope we shall have the opportunity to continue our conversation during the week. There is a great deal I should like to hear about your life since we last met. He bowed again and allowed the Duchess to guide him away. Catherine watched him go, that small smile still playing about her lips. Edward felt as though he might explode. Shall we retire to our rooms? To refresh ourselves before dinner, he said tightly. Catherine nodded, the smile fading as quickly as it had appeared. As you wish, my lord. Their assigned chambers were adjacent, connected by a door that was currently closed and locked. Edward had never attempted to open it, had never visited Catherine's room except once on their wedding night to perform his duty. The experience had been awkward, uncomfortable, and mercifully brief. He had left immediately afterward and never repeated the exercise, having determined that there was no immediate need for an heir. Now, pacing his room while his valet unpacked his belongings, Edward found himself thinking about that locked door with troubling frequency. On the other side, Catherine was presumably directing her lady's maid, selecting gowns for the various entertainments planned throughout the week, preparing herself to be seen and admired by people who included Captain James Bloody Thornton. Edward stopped pacing and forced himself to sit in the chair by the window. He was being irrational. Catherine was his wife. She bore his name. Whatever connection she had once had with the captain was ancient history, of no consequence whatsoever. The fact that she had smiled at Thornton, smiled in a way Edward had never seen directed at him, was meaningless. The fact that they had apparently shared conversations about poetry, that Thornton had found her opinions interesting, that he had remembered their interactions after 3 years had passed all meaningless. The fact that Edward himself could not recall ever asking Catherine about her opinions on poetry or anything else, entirely irrelevant. He was being absurd. He was allowing himself to fall victim to precisely the sort of irrational sentiment his father had warned against. Jealousy was beneath him. It was the province of weak men who allowed their emotions to dictate their behavior. Edward stood and rang for his valet. He would dress for dinner, go down to the drawing-room, conduct himself with perfect propriety, and demonstrate to Catherine and everyone else present that he was entirely untroubled by the presence of some inconsequential captain who had once danced with his wife. Dinner that evening was an elaborate affair, served in the Rothburys' magnificent dining room, beneath glittering chandeliers and Renaissance paintings. The Duke had arranged the seating with careful attention to rank and social precedent. Edward found himself midway down the table, with Lady Hartwick on one side and the Dowager Countess on the other. Catherine, by the vagaries of aristocratic precedence, was seated some distance away, next to Captain Thornton. Edward forced himself to attend to Lady Hartwick's detailed account of her daughter's recent confinement, making appropriate noises at appropriate intervals, while his attention was entirely focused on the conversation occurring several seats away. He could not hear what Catherine and the captain were discussing, but he could see them. See the way Thornton leaned slightly toward her when he spoke. See the way Catherine's face, usually so carefully neutral, became animated. See her laugh, actually laugh aloud, at something the captain said. Edward's knife and fork clattered against his plate more loudly than intended. Lady Hartwick paused in her narrative to glance at him with mild concern. "Are you quite well, Lord Langley?" "Perfectly well," Edward said through clenched teeth. "Do continue." The meal lasted an eternity. By the time the ladies withdrew, leaving the gentlemen to their port and cigars, Edward felt as though he had aged several years. He participated mechanically in the conversation, shooting, politics, the condition of various estates, while his mind remained fixed on the drawing room where Catherine was presumably continuing her conversation with Captain Thornton. When the gentlemen finally rejoined the ladies, Edward scanned the drawing room immediately. Catherine stood near the pianoforte with several other ladies, apparently listening to the Dowager Countess discourse on some topic. Captain Thornton was on the opposite side of the room, engaged with the Duke and several other gentlemen in what appeared to be a spirited discussion. Edward felt marginally less murderous. He approached Catherine's group, positioning himself beside his wife. She glanced up at his arrival, her expression returning to its usual careful neutrality. "Ladies," Edward said, bowing slightly. The Dowager Countess, who had known Edward since his youth, regarded him with sharp eyes. "Langley, your wife has been telling us about the improvements to your gardens at Ashford House. Most impressive." "Catherine has excellent taste in such matters," Edward said, though he had in fact left all decisions regarding the gardens entirely to the head gardener, having no idea until this moment that Catherine had taken any interest in them. "She tells us you have installed a new rose garden," Lady Hartwick added. "I should very much like to see it someday." "You would be most welcome," Catherine said quietly, "though I fear I exaggerated its merits. It is quite modest compared to what their graces have achieved here." "Nonsense," the Dowager Countess said firmly. "One must take pride in one's accomplishments. Lord Langley, you must ensure Lady Langley receives proper credit for her contributions to your estate." "Indeed," Edward said, feeling wrong-footed. "Catherine's contributions are considerable." It was an inadequate response, and he knew it. But before he could attempt to articulate something more meaningful, the Duchess announced that there would be music. Lady Caroline Preston, it seemed, had agreed to perform. The company arranged themselves in chairs and sofas as Lady Caroline took her place at the pianoforte. Edward found himself seated beside Catherine on a small sofa, close enough that the fabric of her gown brushed against his leg. He was acutely conscious of her proximity, of the faint scent of lavender that clung to her, of the way her hands were folded in her lap, utterly still, of the careful space she maintained between them, as though determined to minimize any contact. Lady Caroline began to play. Something by Mozart, Edward thought, though he was no great judge of music. The performance was competent, pleasant, entirely unremarkable. Edward found himself studying Catherine's profile in the candlelight. She was watching the performer with polite attention, but there was a distant quality to her expression, as though her thoughts were far away. What was she thinking? Was she comparing this evening to those long-ago assemblies in London where Captain Thornton had danced with her and discussed poetry? Was she regretting her marriage, wishing she had waited for someone who might have offered her more than wealth and position? The thought was intolerable. Without quite meaning to, Edward shifted slightly closer to his wife. Catherine did not move away, but he felt her stiffen almost imperceptibly. "Did you enjoy your conversation at dinner?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice low enough not to disturb the performance. Catherine turned her head slightly, surprise evident in her expression. "It was perfectly pleasant, my lord." "The captain seems very attentive," Edward said, immediately wishing he had phrased it differently. Something flickered in Catherine's eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or irony. "Captain Thornton has always been kind. He was among the few gentlemen who treated me as though I possessed a mind during my season in London." The implicit criticism in that statement was not lost on Edward. His jaw tightened. "I was not aware you found your season in London so intellectually barren. I found it precisely what it was meant to be," Catherine replied, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear her. "An extended audition for the role of wife, in which the qualities valued were beauty, accomplishments, and breeding in that order. Intelligence was at best irrelevant, at worst a liability." "That seems an unduly cynical view," Edward said stiffly. "Does it?" Catherine met his eyes directly for the first time since they had sat down. "Tell me, my lord, did you ever once during our courtship ask my opinion on any subject of substance? Did you inquire about my interests, my thoughts, my hopes, or did you simply determine that I met your requirements for a viscountess and proceed accordingly?" Edward opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, because the truth was that he had done precisely what she described. He had assessed Catherine Bellingham's suitability based on her family connections, her impeccable reputation, her appropriate demeanor. He had never considered that she might have depths worth exploring, that beneath the quiet exterior there might exist a person of real complexity and feeling. He had, in fact, never considered her as anything more than a particularly well-chosen acquisition. He began, but Lady Caroline had finished her performance and polite applause filled the drawing-room. Catherine stood immediately, using the moment to escape, moving to join the Duchess and several other ladies across the room. Edward remained seated, feeling as though he had received a blow to the solar plexus. The evening continued. More music was performed. Conversations ebbed and flowed. Tea was served. Throughout it all, Edward found himself hyper-aware of Catherine's location, of her movements, of every interaction she had with Captain Thornton, who seemed to find remarkably frequent opportunities to speak with her, despite the Duchess's best efforts to circulate her guests evenly. At one point, Edward observed them standing together near the windows that overlooked the darkened gardens. They were speaking quietly, both slightly apart from the rest of the company. Catherine was holding a teacup, listening as Thornton spoke. Whatever he said caused her to smile again, that small but genuine smile that transformed her entire face. Edward set down his own cup with sufficient force to crack the saucer. Lord Hartwick, standing nearby, raised an eyebrow. "Steady on, Langley. That's Sèvres porcelain." "My apologies," Edward said tightly. A momentary lapse. "Indeed," Hartwick said, following Edward's gaze to where Catherine and Thornton stood. "Handsome fellow, the captain. My wife tells me he was quite the success during his brief stint in London society. Had half the young ladies sighing over him." "How tedious for him," Edward said, his voice like ice. Hartwick chuckled. "Come now, Langley, no need for that tone. The man's perfectly harmless, just being friendly to an old acquaintance." "Yes," Edward said, "perfectly harmless." But as he watched Thornton lean closer to Catherine, saying something that made her laugh aloud, that genuine, unguarded laugh Edward had never heard directed at him, he felt something dark and violent unfurl in his chest. Jealousy, he recognized with bitter clarity, irrational, consuming jealousy. He had spent his entire adult life maintaining perfect control over his emotions. He had prided himself on his rationality, his ability to approach every situation with logic and careful calculation. And now, watching his wife, his quiet, unremarkable wife, whom he had barely noticed for 3 years of marriage, smile at another man, Edward found that every principle he had built his life upon was crumbling to dust. He wanted to cross the room, to insert himself between Catherine and Thornton, to assert his claim in the most primitive way possible. He wanted to demand that Catherine look at him the way she was looking at the captain. He wanted to ask her about poetry, about whatever she had read in that book she carried, about every thought she had ever had that he had been too proud or too blind to inquire about. He wanted, quite desperately, for his wife to see him as something other than the cold, distant stranger he had worked so hard to become. But he did none of these things, because Edward Ashford, Viscount Langley, did not make scenes. He did not succumb to emotion. He maintained his dignity at all costs. So he stood in the drawing-room at Rothbury Park, watching his wife laugh with another man, and felt something inside him begin to break. The following morning dawned grey and humid, the kind of oppressive August weather that promised eventual rain. Edward had slept poorly, his mind turning endlessly over the events of the previous evening. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Catherine smiling at Captain Thornton, saw the animation in her face, the genuine pleasure in her expression. He had never inspired such a response in her, not once in 3 years of marriage. The realization sat in his chest like a stone. Breakfast was served buffet-style in the morning room, allowing guests to rise and eat according to their own schedules. Edward descended early, hoping to avoid the majority of the party. He found the room occupied by only 3 others: Sir William Preston, who was absorbed in the Times, the Dowager Countess, who nodded at him with imperial condescension, and Captain Thornton, who looked insufferably fresh and cheerful despite what must have been a late night. "Good morning, Langley," Thornton said amiably, gesturing to the sideboard laden with chafing dishes. "The kedgeree is excellent. I highly recommend it." Edward murmured something non-committal and helped himself to coffee and toast he had no appetite for. He took a seat as far from Thornton as the relatively small table allowed and attempted to give his attention to his breakfast. "I understand there's to be shooting today," Thornton continued, apparently determined to be friendly. "Rothbury tells me the estate has quite remarkable game birds. Will you be joining the party?" "I had intended to," Edward said shortly. "Splendid. I must confess, I'm rather looking forward to. It's been too long since I've had the opportunity for decent shooting." Thornton paused, then added with what seemed to Edward like deliberate casualness, "I believe the ladies plan to walk in the gardens this morning. The Duchess has quite an impressive collection of dahlias, apparently." Edward's cup clattered against its saucer. "Indeed. Lady Langley mentioned she has a particular interest in gardens," Thornton went on, his tone relentlessly pleasant. "I thought I might offer to show her the folly at the edge of the lake. There's supposedly a rather fine view from there." Something snapped in Edward's carefully maintained composure. He set down his cup with deliberate precision and fixed Thornton with a cold stare. "That will not be necessary, Captain. I am quite capable of showing my own wife the grounds." Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly. "No offense intended, Langley. I merely thought—" "I am not interested in your thoughts," Edward said, his voice low and hard. "My wife's time is her own to dispose of as she wishes, but I would prefer she did not dispose of it in your company." A profound silence fell over the morning room. Sir William looked up from his newspaper, his expression startled. The Dowager Countess regarded Edward with sharp disapproval. Thornton's pleasant expression had vanished, replaced by something considerably cooler. "I beg your pardon, my lord. I had no intention of causing offence. Lady Langley and I are old acquaintances, nothing more. If my friendliness has been misconstrued—" "Your friendliness," Edward interrupted, rising from his chair, "is excessive and unwelcome. I would thank you to remember that Lady Langley is a married woman. Your attentions are inappropriate." "Edward." Catherine's voice, quiet but clear, came from the doorway. He turned sharply. Catherine stood at the threshold, still in her morning dress, her face pale. How long had she been there? How much had she heard? "Catherine," he said, attempting to moderate his tone. I heard what you were saying," she said, stepping into the room. Her eyes moved from Edward to Thornton and back again. "Captain Thornton has behaved with nothing but perfect propriety. If there has been any impropriety, it lies in your accusations, not his actions." Edward felt as though he had been slapped. "Catherine, you do not understand." "I understand perfectly," she said, and there was something in her voice he had never heard before. Not anger. "Precisely, but a kind of weary disappointment that was somehow worse. I understand that you are making a scene based on nothing more than your own, whatever this is. Pride, perhaps, or the unwillingness to see another man treat me with the basic courtesy you have never troubled yourself to provide." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Around them, the other occupants of the room sat frozen, witnesses to what was rapidly becoming a thorough breach of social decorum. "That is not—" Edward began, but Catherine spoke over him. "Captain Thornton," she said, turning to address him directly, "I apologize for my husband's behavior. Please do not feel any obligation to avoid my company on his account. We are, as you said, old acquaintances. I would be pleased to view the folly with you and any other guests who wish to walk this morning." She looked back at Edward then, and the expression on her face was one he would remember for the rest of his life. Not anger, not hurt, just a vast, terrible emptiness. "You have made your position quite clear, my lord," she said quietly. "You do not value my company, my thoughts, or my presence. But you cannot bear to see another man provide what you refuse to give. It is a peculiarly selfish form of cruelty." She turned and left the room, her footsteps fading down the corridor. The silence she left behind was absolute. Edward stood frozen, conscious of 3 pairs of eyes fixed upon him with varying degrees of judgment and disapproval. His carefully cultivated dignity had evaporated. He had made exactly the sort of scene his breeding and upbringing had trained him to avoid. He had allowed emotion to override judgment, jealousy to dictate behavior. He had, in short, become everything his father had warned him against. "If you will excuse me," he said stiffly, and left the room without waiting for a response. He went directly to his chambers and stood in the center of the room, hands clenched at his sides, breathing heavily. His reflection in the mirror above the washstand showed a man whose careful composure had cracked, whose face bore the marks of poorly suppressed emotion. He looked, he realized, like his mother in the old portrait, haunted by something that could not be named or controlled. A soft knock came at the connecting door to Catherine's room. Before Edward could respond, the door opened slightly and Catherine appeared. She had changed into a walking dress of pale green, her hair arranged under a simple straw bonnet. She looked calm, collected, every inch the proper lady. "I am informing you, as courtesy requires, that I am going for a walk," she said formally. "I shall return in time for luncheon." "Catherine, wait," Edward said, moving toward her. "What you said downstairs was the truth," she said flatly, "and we both know it." Edward struggled for words, for some way to articulate the chaos of feelings churning inside him. "I was merely attempting to protect your reputation." Thornton was being overly familiar. "Captain Thornton was being kind," Catherine interrupted. "As he has always been kind. Something you might learn from. Were you capable of recognizing the distinction between kindness and impropriety?" "You seem remarkably concerned with the captain's feelings," Edward said, and hated himself immediately for the petulant tone in his voice. Catherine regarded him with something approaching pity. "I am concerned with being treated as a human being, rather than a possession, my lord. Captain Thornton remembers that I have thoughts and feelings. He remembers conversations we had 3 years ago. He treats me as though my words and opinions have value." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was very soft. "You do not even remember what color my eyes are, do you?" Edward opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, because he realized, with sickening clarity, that he was not entirely certain. Grey, he thought. But was he? Remembering or guessing? Catherine saw the answer in his face. She smiled, but it was the saddest expression Edward had ever witnessed. "Grey," she said quietly, "like rain clouds. My mother always said they were unfortunate, too pale, too unremarkable. I used to wish they were blue or green or any color that might make someone notice them." "Notice me?" She turned toward the door. "But you never have you? In 3 years of marriage, you have never once truly looked at me." "That is not true," Edward said desperately. Catherine, please, do not go." She paused in the doorway but did not turn back. "You have no right to ask that of me. You have no right to demand my presence when you have never wanted it, to command my attention when you have never valued it. I have spent 3 years making myself invisible because you preferred it that way. Do not now ask me to be visible simply because another man has reminded you that I exist." "It is not that," Edward said, though he feared it was exactly that. I am your husband." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "You are my husband. You provide for me. You have given me your name and your house and your protection, but you have never given me yourself. You have never allowed me to know you, never sought to know me. We live in the same house, sleep in rooms that share a wall, and are more strangers than the people we pass in the street." She looked at him then, fully and directly, and Edward felt the full weight of those grey eyes he had never bothered to truly see. "I asked you for my freedom," she said. "You refused, so I accepted that I would remain here, in this marriage, for the remainder of my life. But I will not pretend it is anything other than what it is, a business arrangement, a social convenience. And if someone like Captain Thornton wishes to treat me with genuine human warmth for a few brief days, I will not reject it simply because it makes you uncomfortable to witness what you have never been willing to provide." "Catherine," Edward began, moving toward her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "I am going for a walk. You are welcome to join the shooting party. I am certain the Duke will be disappointed if you do not attend. After all, your social obligations have always been more important than anything else." She closed the door quietly, leaving Edward alone in his room with the ruins of his pride scattered around him like broken glass. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his mind blank with shock. Then slowly, the full magnitude of what had just occurred began to penetrate. He had accused Catherine of impropriety based on nothing but his own jealous instincts. He had insulted a fellow guest and created a scene that would be whispered about in drawing rooms throughout their social circle. He had failed, in the most public way possible, to maintain the dignified composure that was supposed to be the hallmark of his class. But worse than any of that, far worse, was the look on Catherine's face, the terrible, quiet resignation, the acceptance that she would spend the rest of her life married to a man who had never seen her as anything more than a useful accessory to his own existence. Edward sank into the chair by the window, his legs suddenly unsteady. 3 years. He had been married to Catherine for 3 years. They had lived in the same house, taken meals together, attended social functions as a unit, and in all that time, he had never once asked her what she thought, what she felt, what she wanted from life beyond the basic duties of her position. He had not even remembered the color of her eyes. What manner of man did such a thing? What kind of husband treated his wife with less attention than he gave to his horses or his hounds? A man like his father, came the unwelcome answer. A man who believed that emotion was weakness, that love was a dangerous delusion, that marriage was a business transaction best approached with cold rationality. Edward had spent his entire adult life trying to be exactly that man, and he had succeeded magnificently. The result was sitting before him in ruins. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. "Enter," he called, his voice rough. The Duke himself appeared, his expression grave. "Langley, a word if I may." "Of course, Your Grace," Edward said, standing automatically. Rothbury closed the door behind him and regarded Edward with the sort of measured assessment Edward imagined he might use when evaluating a potentially problematic tenant. "I do not as a rule interfere in the private affairs of my guests," the Duke began. "However, when those affairs spill over into public spaces in a manner that disturbs the peace of my house party, I feel compelled to intervene." Edward felt heat rise in his face. "Your Grace, I apologize for the scene at breakfast. It was inexcusable." "It was unfortunate," Rothbury agreed diplomatically. "Captain Thornton is a good fellow and a friend. He has assured me he had no intentions beyond simple courtesy toward Lady Langley. However, I understand that certain situations can provoke reactions that are perhaps stronger than wisdom would dictate." The Duke was being remarkably generous, Edward realized. He was offering Edward a way to frame the situation as a momentary lapse rather than the ugly display of jealous possessiveness it had actually been. "You are most understanding, Your Grace," Edward said stiffly. "I am also," Rothbury continued, "a married man of some years' standing, and I have learned through occasionally painful experience that the felicity of one's marriage is not guaranteed by rank, wealth, or even initial compatibility." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Lady Langley seems a most admirable woman, quiet certainly, but possessed of considerable depth. The Duchess has enjoyed her conversation greatly." The implication was clear. Others had noticed qualities in Catherine that Edward himself had overlooked. "She is—" "Yes," Edward said inadequately. "Then perhaps," the Duke suggested gently, "it might be worth considering whether your response this morning stemmed not from concern for propriety, but from the uncomfortable recognition that another man was according your wife the attention she deserves, and which you have perhaps failed to provide." Edward said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Rothbury moved toward the door, then paused. "My father was a cold man, Langley, believed in duty above all else. My mother withered under his indifference like a plant deprived of water. I determined when I married that I would not repeat his mistakes." He looked back at Edward. "It is never too late to change course, but one must actually make the effort to do so." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Edward remained standing in the center of the room, the Duke's words echoing in his mind. A plant deprived of water. Was that what he had done to Catherine? Starved her of the basic sustenance of human connection, and wondered why she seemed to be withering away. The answer was so obvious it was almost laughable. He had married her, brought her to his house, and proceeded to treat her with the same distant courtesy he might show a competent housekeeper. He had expected her to be grateful for the material comforts he provided while giving her nothing of himself, demanding nothing of her beyond the performance of social duties. And when she had asked, quietly, And with devastating simplicity for her freedom, he had refused, not because he wanted her, but because her departure would be inconvenient, would reflect poorly on his reputation, would disrupt the careful order of his life. He had thought he was being reasonable, rational, controlled. He had actually been profoundly, unforgivably cruel. The realization hit Edward with the force of a physical blow. He sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. Everything Catherine had said was true. He had made her invisible because he preferred it that way. He had never once attempted to know her, to see her, to treat her as anything more than a necessary but unremarkable component of his household. And now, when Captain Thornton had demonstrated what should have been obvious from the beginning, that Catherine was a person of real interest, someone worth knowing and speaking with, and treating as a human being rather than an ornament, Edward had responded not with shame at his own failures, but with rage that another man was providing what he himself had never thought to offer. It was contemptible. He was contemptible. The morning passed in a fog of self-recrimination. Edward did not join the shooting party. He could not face Rothbury or Thornton or any of the other guests who had witnessed his loss of control. Instead, he remained in his room, pacing restlessly, trying to determine what, if anything, could be done to repair the damage he had inflicted. Catherine returned from her walk at luncheon as she had promised. Edward watched from his window as she crossed the lawn toward the house, accompanied by several other ladies and, yes, Captain Thornton. They were laughing about something, the whole group animated and cheerful. Catherine's face was alight with genuine pleasure. Edward felt something twist in his chest that might have been envy or regret, or some combination of both. He did not go down to luncheon. He sent word through his valet that he was unwell, a coward's excuse but the best he could manage. The thought of sitting across from Catherine, of seeing the careful blankness she would adopt in his presence, of watching her transform from the animated woman in the garden to the quiet ghost she became around him, it was more than he could bear. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Edward tried to read, to attend to correspondence, to think about anything other than the wreckage of his marriage. He failed entirely. Evening came. He would have to go. Down to dinner. To avoid it would be to create an even greater scandal than he already had. He dressed with mechanical precision, tying his cravat with hands that trembled slightly, and descended to the drawing room, where the guests were assembling before dinner. Catherine was already there, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that Edward could not recall having seen before. She was speaking with the Duchess, her manner perfectly composed. When Edward entered, she glanced at him briefly, offered the slightest of nods as acknowledgement of his presence, and returned her attention to her conversation. She was treating him with impeccable courtesy and absolute indifference. It was, Edward realized, exactly how he had treated her for 3 years. The parallel was not lost on him. Dinner was an exercise in endurance. Edward was seated between Lady Hartwick and an elderly baroness, who spoke at length about her various ailments. He responded mechanically, his attention fixed on Catherine, who was once again seated near Captain Thornton. But something had changed. Catherine was not smiling at the captain as she had the previous evening. She was perfectly polite, but there was a distance in her manner that had not been there before. Thornton, for his part, seemed subdued, his usual easy charm somewhat dimmed. Edward should have felt satisfaction. Instead, he felt only a deeper sense of shame. He had not protected Catherine's reputation this morning. He had not defended her honor. He had simply revealed himself to be the small, jealous, controlling man he apparently was, beneath his veneer of aristocratic dignity. After dinner, when the gentlemen rejoined the ladies, Edward sought out Captain Thornton. The younger man regarded him with wary courtesy. "Captain," Edward said quietly, keeping his voice low enough not to be overheard, "I owe you an apology for my behavior this morning. It was ungentlemanly and unjustified. You have conducted yourself with perfect propriety. The fault lies entirely with me." Thornton studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Apology accepted, Langley. Though I confess, it is not my forgiveness you should be seeking." "I am aware," Edward said heavily. "She is a remarkable woman," Thornton said, glancing across the room to where Catherine sat with several other ladies. "I realized that 3 years ago. It is unfortunate that you did not." "Yes," Edward agreed, the word like ashes in his mouth. "It is." Thornton regarded him with something that might have been sympathy. For what it is worth, I believe she cares for you more than you know, or perhaps cared, past tense. Whether there is anything left to salvage, only you can determine. He moved away, leaving Edward standing alone with that small, devastating observation. Whether there is anything left to salvage. Was there? Had he destroyed whatever small, fragile possibility of genuine marriage might have existed? Had he, through 3 years of systematic neglect and one morning of jealous possession, killed whatever capacity Catherine might have had to see him as anything other than the cold, indifferent stranger he had worked so hard to be? Edward did not know. But as he watched his wife across the drawing room, moving through the evening's entertainments with perfect poise and careful emptiness, he realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. He did not want to lose her. Not because her loss would be socially inconvenient, or because it would damage his reputation, or because he needed her to fulfill her duties as his viscountess, but because Catherine, quiet, overlooked Catherine, whom he had dismissed as unremarkable and easily satisfied, was in fact the most extraordinary person he had ever failed to notice, and he had no idea how to tell her so, or whether, after everything he had done and failed to do, she would care, even if he found the words. The remainder of the house party passed in a state of exquisite discomfort. Edward and Catherine maintained the appearance of civility, speaking to one another when social necessity demanded it, appearing together at meals and entertainments as their roles required. To the casual observer, they might have seemed a perfectly ordinary married couple, perhaps slightly more reserved than some, but otherwise unremarkable. Edward knew better. The careful distance Catherine maintained, the way she positioned herself just slightly out of his reach, the manner in which her eyes would slide past him without quite making contact. These were the actions of a woman who had withdrawn so far into herself that she had become, in all ways that mattered, unreachable. He had made her a ghost, and now he was haunted by her absence. The house party concluded on a Tuesday. Edward and Catherine made their farewells to the Duke and Duchess with appropriate gratitude, endured the journey back to Hertfordshire in a carriage filled with oppressive silence, and returned to Ashford House as the sun was setting over the gardens Catherine apparently loved, but which Edward had never thought to walk in with her. They separated immediately upon arrival, Catherine retreating to her rooms, Edward to his study. The house, which had always seemed a model of well-ordered efficiency, now felt cavernous and cold. In the days that followed, Catherine perfected the art of existing in Edward's proximity while remaining entirely absent. She appeared at breakfast and took her place at the table, but brought with her always a book or a letter that required her attention, creating a barrier of occupation that discouraged any attempt at conversation. She continued to manage the household with flawless efficiency, consulting with Mrs. Holbrook and giving instructions to the staff, but always at times when Edward was elsewhere, conducting her domestic duties with the stealth of a creature that has learned to avoid predators. In the evenings, she no longer joined Edward in the drawing room. Instead, she would send word through her maid that she was fatigued, or had a headache, or had correspondence that required immediate attention. Edward never challenged these excuses. What right had he to demand her company after he had made it abundantly clear for 3 years that he did not value it? He found himself wandering the house at odd hours, pausing outside rooms where he heard Catherine's voice consulting with servants, standing in corridors where the faint scent of lavender suggested she had recently passed. He had become, he realized with bitter irony, a phantom in his own house, haunting the periphery of his wife's existence, just as she had once haunted the periphery of his. A week after their return from Rothbury Park, Edward received a letter from his solicitor in London, requesting his presence to discuss some matter regarding one of his smaller properties. The trip would require at least 3 days, perhaps longer, depending on how quickly the business could be concluded. He informed Catherine of his departure over breakfast, one of the rare occasions when she could not avoid his presence without creating obvious awkwardness. "I must go to London," he said, attempting to sound matter-of-fact. "Legal matters regarding the property in Surrey. I expect to be away until Friday at the earliest." Catherine nodded without looking up from her tea. "I hope your business goes well, my lord." "Will you—" Edward hesitated, uncertain what he was even asking. "That is, I trust you will be comfortable here in my absence." A bitter smile touched Catherine's lips, there and gone in an instant. "I have been comfortable in your absence for 3 years, my lord. I suspect I shall manage a few more days." The words struck with the precision of a blade. Edward set down his fork. Appetite entirely vanished. "Catherine, I know I have failed you. I know that my behavior at Rothbury Park was inexcusable, but He struggled for words, for some way to articulate feelings he had spent his entire life learning to suppress. "I would like, if you would permit me." "Yes, my lord?" Catherine prompted, her tone perfectly polite and utterly devoid of warmth. Edward looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw only the careful mask she had constructed. He had no idea what lay beneath it anymore. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps he had succeeded in killing whatever had once existed there. "Nothing," he said finally. "It was nothing. It's of consequence." Catherine returned her attention to her tea, and Edward understood that he had missed whatever small opening might have existed. He departed for London that afternoon. The city in late August was stifling, thick with heat, and the smell of too many people pressed too close together. Edward's townhouse in Mayfair was stuffy from having been closed up for the summer, the furniture shrouded in dust covers, the rooms echoing with emptiness. His business with the solicitor was concluded with depressing efficiency in a single afternoon. There was no reason to remain in London. He could have returned to Hertfordshire immediately. Instead, he stayed. He told himself it was practical. There were other matters he could attend to, correspondence to answer, investments to review. But the truth, which he could not quite avoid acknowledging, was that he remained in London because returning to Ashford House meant confronting the reality of what his marriage had become, and he was not yet ready to face it. On his second evening in London, Edward found himself at his club nursing a brandy in the reading room and making no pretense of actually reading the newspaper spread before him. The room was sparsely populated. Most of society had fled to their country estates for the summer, but a few other gentlemen were scattered about in various states of repose. "Langley, didn't expect to find you in town this time of year." Edward looked up to find Lord Hartwick settling into the chair across from him, his own glass of brandy in hand. "Hartwick, I had some business to attend to, and yourself?" "Much the same. Wife wanted to do some shopping before we head to Scotland next week." Hartwick took a long drink, then fixed Edward with a speculative look. "Saw you at Rothbury's house party. Seemed to be some tension there. Everything well with Lady Langley?" It was the sort of question that could have been deflected with ease, dismissed with a vague pleasantry and a change of subject. Instead, Edward heard himself say, "No, everything is decidedly not well." Hartwick's eyebrows rose. "I see. Sorry to hear it." He paused, then asked carefully, "Anything a friend might help with?" Edward laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Unless you can advise me on how to repair 3 years of systematic neglect and fundamental failure as a husband, I fear not." Hartwick was silent for a moment, studying Edward with more perception than Edward had given him credit for. "That's rather specific. I take it you've come to some realizations." "I have realized," Edward said slowly, "that I have been married for 3 years to a woman I know nothing about, that I have treated her with less consideration than I show to my servants, that I have been so concerned with maintaining the appearance of a proper marriage that I never bothered to consider whether there might be any substance beneath the form." "Ah," Hartwick said. "Yes, I can see how that might present difficulties." "She asked me for a separation," Edward continued, the words spilling out now that they had started. "Before Rothbury's party, she was perfectly civil about it. Said she wanted her freedom, or as much freedom as was possible given the circumstances. I refused, of course. Told her it was impossible, impractical, would cause scandal. But not," Hartwick observed, "that you wanted her to stay." Edward's silence was answer enough. "My father," Hartwick said after a moment, "gave me a piece of advice before I married. He said that a wife is not a piece of furniture to be acquired and then forgotten. She is a living woman who will change, grow, develop in ways you cannot predict. You can either change and grow alongside her, or you can wake up one day and discover you're living with a stranger." "Wise man, your father," Edward said hollowly. "He was. Still is, actually, though he's retired to Bath now." Hartwick leaned forward slightly. "The thing is, Langley, it's not too late. Difficult, certainly. Humbling, absolutely. But not too late. Not if you're willing to actually do the work. What work? Edward asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. How does one repair something one didn't even realize was broken until it had shattered completely? You start, Hartwig said simply, by being honest. With yourself and with her. You admit you were wrong. You ask her what she needs. And then, and this is the crucial part, you actually listen to the answer and act upon it. She doesn't want anything from me, Edward said. She's made that abundantly clear. She wants to be left alone. Does she? Hartwig challenged. Or does she want to be left alone because that's less painful than wanting things from someone who has demonstrated repeatedly that he won't provide them? The question hit Edward like a fist to the sternum, because of course that was it. Catherine had not stopped wanting. She had simply learned that wanting brought only disappointment. And so, she had trained herself to stop, or to appear to stop, which was perhaps not the same thing at all. I don't know how to fix this, Edward admitted quietly. I don't know how to be whatever it is she needs me to be. Then perhaps, Hartwig suggested, you should ask her. Edward remained in London for 2 more days, Hartwig's words circling endlessly through his mind. Ask her. Be honest. Listen. Such simple advice. And yet it required a fundamental transformation of everything Edward had believed about himself, about marriage, about the proper conduct of a gentleman of his station. It required him to be vulnerable, to admit failure, to acknowledge need, everything his father had taught him to avoid. On Friday morning, Edward stood in his London townhouse and looked at the shrouded furniture, the dust-covered paintings, the evidence of a life half-lived. Then he called for his valet, instructed him to begin packing, and made arrangements for their immediate departure. He could not remain in London indefinitely, avoiding the consequences of his own failures. Catherine was at Ashford House, his wife was at Ashford House, and if there was any hope, however small, of salvaging what remained of their marriage, he would find it there, not hiding in the city like a coward. The journey back to Hertfordshire seemed interminable. Edward spent it rehearsing and discarding various speeches, trying to find words adequate to express regret, apology, hope. Nothing seemed sufficient. How did one apologize for systematic neglect? What words could possibly convey, I am sorry I treated you as though you were invisible. I am sorry I never bothered to know you. I am sorry I made you feel as though your very existence was an inconvenience. The sun was setting when his carriage pulled up to the front of Ashford House. Edward descended, waving off the footman who moved to help with his luggage, and entered the house with a sense of foreboding he could not quite name. The entrance hall was quiet, the late afternoon light slanting through the tall windows and casting long shadows across the marble floor. Edward handed his hat and gloves to the butler and asked, "Where is Lady Langley?" "Her ladyship has retired to her rooms, my lord. She asked not to be disturbed." Of course she had. Edward nodded and dismissed the butler, then stood alone in the cavernous hall, irresolute. He could go to his study, attend to the correspondence that had doubtless accumulated in his absence, maintain the fiction that all was well. Or he could go to Catherine's rooms. He could knock on that door he had only ever entered once, on a wedding night neither of them wished to remember. He could attempt to begin the impossible work of repairing what he had broken. Edward found himself climbing the stairs before he had consciously decided to do so. The corridor outside Catherine's rooms was dim, lit only by the last rays of the setting sun through a window at the far end. He stood before her door, his hand raised to knock, and felt something very like fear settle in his chest. What if she refused to see him? What if she heard him out with that terrible, polite indifference and then asked him to leave? What if he had destroyed so thoroughly any possibility of connection that nothing he could say would matter? He knocked anyway. There was a long silence. Then the sound of movement from within. The door opened to reveal Catherine's lady's maid, who looked startled to see Edward standing there. "My lord, we were not expecting, that is, Lady Langley is—" "I would like to speak with my wife," Edward said, his voice firmer than he felt. "If she will see me." The maid glanced back into the room uncertainly, then bobbed a curtsy and disappeared. Edward heard a brief, low-voiced exchange he could not make out. Then Catherine herself appeared in the doorway. She had changed out of her day dress into something simpler, more comfortable. Her hair had been partially unpinned, falling in soft waves around her face. She looked, Edward thought, more real than he had ever seen her, less like the perfectly composed Viscountess, and more like a woman interrupted in a private moment. "My lord," she said, her tone neutral, "I was not expecting your return so soon." "My business concluded more quickly than anticipated," Edward said. "Catherine, may I come in? I would like to speak with you." Something flickered in her expression. Wariness, perhaps, or resignation. "Is something wrong? Has something occurred that requires immediate discussion?" "No, that is yes, not in the way you mean." Edward was making a hash of this already. "Please, Catherine, I will not take much of your time, but there are things I need to say." For a long moment he thought she would refuse. Then she stepped back, opening the door wider in silent invitation. Edward entered his wife's private chambers for only the second time in 3 years of marriage. The room was smaller than he had remembered, more intimate. It was decorated in shades of pale blue and cream, with watercolors on the walls depicting landscapes Edward did not recognize. A book lay open on the small table beside the chair by the fireplace. A half-finished piece of embroidery sat on the ottoman. These small signs of occupation, of a life lived in this space, struck Edward with unexpected force. This was Catherine's world, the place where she existed when she was not performing the role of Lady Langley for his benefit and the benefit of society. And he had never once thought to enter it, to see what she had made of this space, to understand her through the choices she had made in arranging it. Catherine remained standing by the door, her arms crossed slightly, her posture defensive. "What did you wish to discuss, my lord?" Edward turned to face her, acutely conscious that he had no prepared speech, no carefully reasoned argument. He had only the raw, uncomfortable truth. "I have been the worst possible husband," he said bluntly. Catherine blinked, clearly not having expected such directness. That is rather dramatic." "It is the simple truth," Edward interrupted. "I have treated you with less consideration than I show to people I barely know. I have taken you for granted, dismissed your existence, made you feel invisible in your own home. Everything you said to me, at Rothbury Park and before, was correct. I have failed you in every way a husband can fail a wife, short of actual cruelty." Catherine stared at him, her expression unreadable. "What has prompted this confession?" "Nothing has prompted it, or rather, everything has prompted it. The accumulated weight of 3 years of systematic blindness." Edward took a breath, forcing himself to maintain eye contact, even though every instinct screamed at him to look away. "I cannot apologize adequately for what I have done. There are no words sufficient to express my regret. But I need you to know that I see it now. I see what I've done, and I am profoundly, devastatingly sorry." Silence filled the room. Catherine's arms tightened slightly around herself, as though she were holding something together by force of will. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice very small. "Why now? Why are you saying these things now?" "Because I very nearly lost you," Edward said simply. "Not physically. You are still here, still my wife in name. But I nearly lost any chance of having more than that. I saw you smile at Captain Thornton, saw you come alive in a way I have never witnessed, and I realized I had no idea who you were. Worse, I realized you had no reason to show me, because I had made it abundantly clear for 3 years that I had no interest in knowing." "So this is about Captain Thornton," Catherine said, something bitter entering her tone. "This is about your pride, your possessiveness." "No," Edward interrupted forcefully. "Or rather, yes. That was part of it initially. I won't lie and say jealousy played no role. But that is not why I'm here now. I'm here because I want to know you, Catherine. I want to know what books you read, what you think about in the mornings when you walk in the gardens, what you wish for, what makes you laugh, what causes you pain. I want to understand the person I have been married to for 3 years, but have never actually met." Catherine's eyes had grown bright with unshed tears. "And if I said it was too late? If I told you that I have spent 3 years learning not to want those things from you, that I have protected myself by not hoping for more? Then I would ask," Edward said quietly, "if you might be willing to try anyway. Not for my sake. I have no right to ask anything for my sake, but for yours. Because you deserve more than this empty shell of a marriage. You deserve to be seen, known, valued, and if you will permit me, I would like to try to be the husband who provides those things. Permit you, Catherine repeated, and there was something almost despairing in her voice. Edward, don't you understand? I don't want to have to give you permission to treat me like a human being. I don't want this to be something you do out of guilt or obligation or fear of losing— What? Your convenient household arrangements? The words stung, but Edward accepted them. They were fair, more than fair. You're right, he said. Of course you're right, and I cannot promise that I know how to be what you need. I was raised by a man who believed sentiment was weakness, who treated my mother with the same cold courtesy I have shown you, who taught me that duty and control were the only virtues worth cultivating. He paused, his voice roughening. But I have seen where that path leads. I have seen my mother's portrait, the hopefulness in her young face, and known that my father killed that hopefulness as surely as if he had used a weapon. And I have watched you, over these past weeks, fade a little, more each day, and I will not continue to be the instrument of your diminishment. A tear escaped down Catherine's cheek. She brushed it away impatiently. Pretty words, Edward. But words are easy. I have heard apologies before from men who were sorry for their behavior but never sorry enough to actually change it. Then I will change, Edward said desperately. Tell me what you need, Catherine. Tell me what would make this bearable for you, and I will do it. I need— Catherine's voice broke. She pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking with the effort of containing her tears. I need not to feel this way anymore. I need not to wake up each morning in a beautiful house with everything I could materially want and still feel like I'm suffocating. I need not to sit across from you at dinner and feel the weight of your indifference like a physical thing. I need— She lowered her hands, looking at him with eyes full of anguish. I need you to care, Edward. Not because it's proper, not because it's expected, but because you actually want to. And I don't know if that's something you can manufacture, even if you try. The truth of her words settled over Edward like a shroud. Because she was right, wanting could not be forced, caring could not be commanded. One either felt it or did not. But Edward realized, with sudden, crystalline clarity, that he did feel it. Somewhere during these past weeks of watching Catherine withdraw, of recognizing the person he had failed to notice for 3 years, of understanding the magnitude of his own blindness, he had begun to care, not out of obligation or propriety, but because Catherine, in all her quiet strength and resilient grace, had become precious to him. He had just realized it far too late. I do care, he said, and his voice shook with the force of his sincerity. I know I have no right to expect you to believe me. I know I have forfeited any claim to your trust. But Catherine, I swear to you, I do care. I care that you are unhappy. I care that I have made you so. I care that you spend your mornings alone in the gardens because that is the only peace you can find. I care that you have made yourself invisible because you learned that visibility brought only disappointment. Catherine was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. Then why couldn't you have cared sooner? Why did it take my asking for my freedom, my smiling at another man, for you to see me at all? I don't know, Edward admitted, his own eyes burning. I have asked myself that same question 100 times. All I can say is that I was blind and now I see, and I am asking, begging, for the chance to do better. Catherine turned away, moving to the window and staring out at the darkening gardens. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I'm so tired, Edward. Tired of hoping for things that never come. Tired of pretending this is a real marriage. Tired of being lonely in a house full of people. She turned back to face him, and the exhaustion in her face was heartbreaking. I don't know if I have the strength to hope again. I don't know if I can survive being disappointed one more time. Edward crossed the room slowly, carefully, stopping a few feet away from her, close enough to speak softly, far enough to give her space to refuse him. Then don't hope. Not yet. Just allow me to try. Give me the opportunity to prove through actions, not words, that I mean what I say. If after a month, 2 months, however long you require, you still wish to live separately, I will not stand in your way. I will arrange whatever you need, no matter the scandal, no matter the consequences. But please, Catherine, please give me this chance. Catherine studied his face in the dimming light, searching for something, Sincerity, perhaps, or some sign that this was more than a temporary passion that would fade with time. 1 month, she said finally. 1 month in which you will actually make an effort to know me, to see me, to treat me as a person rather than a possession. And if at the end of that month I feel that nothing has truly changed—" She paused, her voice hardening slightly. "Then we will discuss more permanent arrangements. Do you agree?" "Yes," Edward said immediately. "Yes, I agree." Catherine nodded slowly, then gestured toward the door. "Then I suggest you begin tomorrow, my lord. I am tired now, and I believe we have both said enough for one evening." It was a dismissal, but a gentle one. Edward bowed slightly and moved toward the door. As he reached it, he paused and looked back. "Catherine?" "Yes?" "Grey," he said quietly. "Like rain clouds, though your mother was wrong. They're quite beautiful." He left before she could respond, closing the door softly behind him. In the corridor, Edward leaned against the wall and released a shaking breath. 1 month. He had 1 month to learn how to be the husband he should have been from the beginning. 1 month. To undo 3 years of damage. It seemed an impossible task. But as Edward made his way to his own chambers, he felt something he had not experienced in weeks. Hope. Fragile, uncertain hope. But hope nonetheless. The morning after his conversation with Catherine, Edward woke before dawn with a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. 1 month. He had promised Catherine 1 month to demonstrate that he could change, that he could be the husband she deserved, rather than the distant stranger he had been. He would not waste a single day of it. His first challenge, he realized as he dressed with meticulous care, was that he had no idea how to court his own wife. The conventions of courtship he had learned as a young man were entirely inadequate for this situation. One could not simply call upon Catherine with flowers and poetry. She lived in his house, bore his name, had already endured the disappointment of discovering what manner of man she had married. He needed to demonstrate change, not perform courtship. He needed to show her through consistent action that he saw her, valued her, wished to know her. But how? Edward was saved from his circular thoughts by a memory of something Hartwick had said. Ask her what she needs. Listen to the answer. Simple advice. Remarkably difficult in practice for a man who had spent his entire adult life believing he knew what was best for everyone around him. Nevertheless, it was a place to start. Catherine had not appeared at breakfast. Whether because she was genuinely tired or because she wished to avoid him, Edward could not say. He took his meal alone, then went in search of Mrs. Holbrook, the housekeeper. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said when he found her in the still room consulting with the cook about preserves, "I find myself in need of information regarding Lady Langley's daily routine. Could you tell me how her ladyship typically spends her mornings?" Mrs. Holbrook looked startled. Understandable, as Edward had never previously shown the slightest interest in his wife's activities. "Her ladyship generally rises early, my lord. She takes breakfast in her rooms, then walks in the gardens for an hour or so. After that, she typically retires to the morning room for correspondence or reading." "The gardens," Edward repeated. "The same path each day?" "Usually toward the lake, my lord, through the rose garden and along the gravel path. She seems quite fond of that particular walk." "Thank you, Mrs. Holbrook. That will be all." The following morning, Edward rose even earlier than usual and made his way to the gardens, just as the sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The air was cool, still heavy with the previous night's dew, and remarkably peaceful. He found Catherine already there, walking slowly along the gravel path toward the lake, a light shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. She had not yet noticed his presence. Edward approached carefully, not wishing to startle her. "Good morning, Catherine." She turned sharply, surprise evident on her face. "Edward, I did not expect— That is, you are up very early." "As are you," Edward observed. "I wondered if you might permit me to walk with you." Catherine hesitated, and Edward could see the wariness in her expression, the instinctive resistance to allowing him into this private ritual. But after a moment, she nodded slightly. "If you wish." They walked in silence for several minutes, following the path Catherine had worn smooth with her daily journeys. Edward found himself acutely conscious of everything around him, the sound of gravel crunching beneath their feet, the distant song of early birds, the way the light filtered through the trees and cast dancing shadows across Catherine's face. How many mornings had she walked this path alone, while he remained in the house, oblivious to the beauty of what existed just beyond his study windows? "This is quite lovely," Edward said. "Finally. I had forgotten how peaceful the gardens are at this hour." "I find it the best part of the day," Catherine replied quietly. "Everything is still and quiet. The house has not yet begun its routines. One can almost imagine being entirely alone in the world." Edward heard the subtext beneath her words. One can almost imagine escaping the unhappiness of real life. The realization stung, but he pushed the pain aside. This was not about his feelings. It was about Catherine's. "What is it you think about when you walk?" he asked. Catherine glanced at him, clearly surprised by the question. Various things, nothing of great consequence." "I would like to know anyway," Edward said, "if you're willing to share." She was silent for so long that Edward thought she would not answer. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "Sometimes I think about the gardens themselves, what might be planted, how the paths might be improved. Sometimes I think about books I've read, or things I've seen." She paused, then continued more quietly. "Sometimes I think about what my life might have been if I had made different choices, or if different choices had been made for me." "Do you regret it?" Edward asked, though he feared he knew the answer. "Marrying me?" Catherine stopped walking and turned to face him. In the early morning light, her face was very pale, very serious. "I regret," she said carefully, "that I entered marriage with expectations that could never be fulfilled. I regret that I was young and foolish enough to hope that proximity might breed affection, that time might create intimacy. But I do not know if I regret the marriage itself. It is impossible to regret something that comprises one's entire adult life." It was not quite an answer, but Edward understood the evasion. To admit regret would be to admit that years of her life had been wasted, and who could bear such a recognition? "I regret it," Edward said quietly. "Not the fact of our marriage, but the way I have conducted myself within it. I regret every day I did not ask you these questions. Every morning I remained in my study while you walked alone. Every evening I retreated behind my newspaper rather than attempt conversation. I regret that I have caused you to spend your mornings imagining yourself alone in the world, rather than wishing for my company." Catherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Please don't say these things if you don't mean them. I cannot bear false hope again." "I mean every word," Edward said with all the conviction he possessed, "and I intend to prove it." They continued their walk, and Edward asked more questions. What flowers did Catherine prefer? Which parts of the garden did she find most appealing? Had she considered any changes to the plantings? Catherine answered hesitantly at first, as though testing whether his interest was genuine, but gradually, as Edward continued to ask and listen, truly listen, attending to her words rather than merely waiting for his turn to speak, she became more forthcoming. She preferred roses, it transpired, particularly the old-fashioned varieties that bloomed with abandon rather than the more formal modern hybrids. She thought the area near the lake might benefit from some ornamental grasses to soften the edges of the water. She had always wished for a small herb garden near the kitchen, but had never felt confident enough to suggest it to the head gardener. "Consider it done," Edward said immediately. "Speak with the gardener this very afternoon if you wish. The grounds are as much yours as mine, more so given the amount of time you spend here. You should shape them according to your preferences." Catherine looked at him with such surprise that Edward felt another sharp pang of guilt. Had he really made her feel so powerless in her own home that she required his explicit permission to plant herbs? Apparently he had. That evening at dinner, where Catherine appeared after Edward sent an explicit request through her maid that he very much hoped she would join him, Edward asked about the books she read. Catherine, clearly still adjusting to this new dynamic, answered with some hesitancy. She enjoyed novels, she admitted, though she knew they were often considered frivolous. She had a particular fondness for the works of Miss Austen, whose observations on society she found both witty and perceptive. "I have never read Miss Austen," Edward confessed, "though I understand her works are much admired, which would you recommend I begin with?" Catherine stared at him as though he had suggested something radical. You wish to read novels?" "I wish to understand what interests you," Edward said simply. If you find pleasure and insight in Miss Austen's work, then I should like to discover what it is you see in them." "Pride and Prejudice," Catherine said after a moment. "I believe that is her finest work, though they are all worth reading." The next day, Edward sent to the bookseller in the Y village for a copy of Pride and Prejudice. When it arrived, he began reading it that very evening in his study. He found himself immediately arrested by the opening sentence. "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife," and recognized with uncomfortable clarity the satire implicit in those words. Miss Austen was mocking the very assumptions Edward had brought to his own marriage, that wealth and position were sufficient foundations for matrimony, that the feelings and desires of the individuals involved were secondary considerations. He could see why Catherine loved these books. They articulated everything she must have felt but been unable to say. Edward read late into the night, then continued the following day. When he had finished, he sought out Catherine in the morning room, where she was attending to correspondence. "I have finished Pride and Prejudice," he announced. Catherine looked up from her letter, surprise evident on her face. "Already, but I only recommended it 2 days ago." "I found it compelling," Edward said, settling into the chair across from her. "Miss Bennet's gradual realization that she has misjudged Mr. Darcy, it is quite brilliantly done. And Darcy himself—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Darcy begins the novel as a proud, insufferable man who believes his wealth and status excuse his poor behavior. He must be humbled, must recognize his faults, before he can deserve Elizabeth's affection." "Yes," Catherine said softly, "that is precisely the arc of his character." "I wonder," Edward said, meeting her eyes directly, "whether Miss Austen would consider a man capable of such transformation in real life as well as in fiction." Catherine held his gaze for a long moment. "I believe Miss Austen would say that true change requires not just recognition of one's faults, but sustained effort to correct them. Mr. Darcy does not simply apologize to Elizabeth. He proves his change through his actions, helping her family, treating those beneath his station with respect, demonstrating consistent kindness rather than arrogant superiority." "Then I shall endeavor to follow his example," Edward said quietly. The days passed, settling into a new rhythm. Edward joined Catherine for her morning walks each day, asking questions, listening to her answers, learning the contours of her thoughts and preferences. He requested her opinions on estate matters, actually, attending to her suggestions rather than dismissing them out of hand. When tenants came with concerns, he invited Catherine to sit with him and hear their grievances, valuing her perspective on the human dimensions of problems he had previously approached with only pragmatic calculation. In the evenings they read together in the drawing room, sometimes aloud, sometimes in companionable silence. Edward found himself sharing details of his day, his concerns about various matters, things he would never have thought to discuss with Catherine before because he had assumed she would neither understand nor care. He had been wrong on both counts. Catherine understood a great deal, it turned out. She had spent 3 years observing the workings of his household and estate with careful attention, learning through pure proximity what she had never been taught explicitly. Her observations were often more acute than Edward's own, particularly regarding the human elements he tended to overlook in his focus on efficiency and profit. 3 weeks into their month of trial, Edward came to a realization that should have been obvious from the beginning. He enjoyed Catherine's company. He found her conversation interesting, her observations perceptive, her quiet humor more appealing than the loud wit he had always associated with engaging discourse. She was not unremarkable. She had never been unremarkable. He had simply been too blind to notice. But the question remained, was it enough? Had these 3 weeks of genuine attention and effort made any difference to Catherine's feelings? Or had he destroyed too thoroughly any possibility of real affection? Edward could not tell. Catherine remained cautious, guarded. She participated in their conversations, joined him for walks and meals, seemed to appreciate his efforts. But there was still a distance in her, a careful reserve that prevented true intimacy. She did not trust him yet, and Edward could not blame her for that. The month he had requested was nearly over when circumstances intervened in the form of a letter from Catherine's mother. Lady Bellingham was unwell, nothing serious, but she wished to see her daughter and hoped Catherine might visit for a few days. Catherine approached Edward in his study with the letter in hand, her expression carefully neutral. "My mother has written," she said without preamble. "She is unwell and wishes me to visit. I thought I should inform you before making arrangements." Edward looked up from the accounts he had been reviewing. "Of course you must go. I will have the carriage prepared for tomorrow morning if that suits you." "Thank you," Catherine said, turning to leave. "Catherine, wait." Edward rose from his desk. "Might I accompany you?" She turned back, surprise evident on her face. "To Kent, to visit my mother, if you would permit it. I realize I have never met your mother outside of the formal occasions surrounding our wedding. It seems I should like to know your family better, to understand where you came from." Catherine studied him for a long moment, something complex and unreadable moving across her face. "My mother is not always easy company," she said finally. "She has strong opinions and does not hesitate to share them." "Neither quality disturbs me," Edward said, "unless you would prefer I not accompany you." "No, Catherine paused, then said quietly, "I would not object to your company, if you truly wish to come." They departed the following morning, the journey to Kent requiring most of the day. Edward used the time to ask Catherine about her childhood, her family, the home she had left behind when she married. Catherine answered his questions, gradually warming to the subject as she spoke of her younger sisters, the peculiarities of her father's estate, the small village where she had grown up. "I was always the quiet one," she said at one point, gazing out the carriage window at the passing countryside. "My sisters were more vivacious, more conventionally pretty. My mother despaired of me during my season, said I did not make enough effort to be charming, to attract notice. When you made your offer, she was relieved, grateful that I had managed to secure such an advantageous match despite my limitations." "You have no limitations," Edward said firmly. "Your mother was wrong, as was I, for failing to see your worth from the beginning." Catherine glanced at him, something vulnerable flickering in her expression. "Do you truly believe that? Or are you simply saying what you think I wish to hear?" "I believe it, absolutely," Edward said. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever failed to notice, and I count that failure as the greatest of my life." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly and returned her attention to the window. They arrived at the Bellingham estate in late afternoon. Lady Bellingham, who was indeed unwell, but not dangerously so, greeted them with evident pleasure and barely concealed surprise at Edward's presence. "Lord Langley, what an unexpected delight! Catherine, you did not mention your husband would be accompanying you." "It was a recent decision, Mamma," Catherine said, allowing her mother to embrace her. "How are you feeling?" "Oh, tolerable, tolerable. Nothing that rest and your company won't cure." Lady Bellingham turned her sharp gaze on Edward. "You are most welcome, of course, though I confess I cannot imagine what brings a busy man like yourself away from his estates to visit an invalid mother-in-law." "The desire to know my wife's family better," Edward said simply, "a deficiency I have allowed to persist far too long." Lady Bellingham's eyebrows rose, but she said nothing, merely gesturing them toward the drawing room where tea was being laid out. Over the next 2 days, Edward observed Catherine in her childhood home and understood her better for it. He saw how she interacted with her younger sisters, 2 lively girls who had married local gentlemen and lived nearby. He watched her tend to her mother with patient attention, reading aloud, adjusting pillows, providing comfort with natural ease. He saw, too, how her family treated her. Her sisters spoke over her frequently, dismissing her quieter observations in favor of their own more emphatic opinions. Her mother, while clearly fond of Catherine, seemed to view her eldest daughter as somehow lesser than her more vivacious siblings, an attitude that manifested in small cutting remarks about Catherine's reserved nature, her preference for reading over social activities, her failure to produce the same obvious charm her sisters displayed. Edward found himself growing increasingly angry on Catherine's behalf. These people who claimed to love her had spent her entire life making her feel inadequate, unremarkable, less than. No wonder she had entered marriage expecting to be overlooked. She had been overlooked her entire life. Until their final evening before returning to Hertfordshire, Edward found Catherine alone in the small garden behind the house. She was sitting on a stone bench, gazing at nothing in particular, her expression pensive. "May I join you?" he asked. Catherine nodded, and Edward settled beside her on the bench. For several minutes they sat in silence, the evening air cooling around them. "Your family does not appreciate you as they should," Edward said finally. Catherine glanced at him, surprise evident on her face. "They love me in their way." "Perhaps," Edward allowed, "but love without appreciation is a hollow thing. They have taught you to make yourself small, to believe that your quietness is a failing rather than a strength. They are wrong, Catherine, profoundly wrong." Catherine's hands twisted in her lap. "You sound very certain." "I am certain. I was wrong about many things, but I am not wrong about this." Edward turned to face her more fully. "Your sisters are pleasant enough, but their conversation is shallow, focused entirely on trivialities. Your mother is kind, but has allowed social convention to dictate her perception of what constitutes value in a person. They have all failed to recognize that true worth lies not in volume or vivacity, but in depth, in thoughtfulness, in the quiet strength to endure disappointment with grace." "Edward," Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. "I have spent the past month learning to know you," Edward continued, "and I have discovered someone far more interesting, more perceptive, more valuable than anyone I have ever met, not despite your quietness, but because of it. Because you observe rather than simply react, because you think before you speak, because you possess depths that more obviously charming people lack entirely." A tear slid down Catherine's cheek. "You cannot know how much I needed to hear someone say such things." "Then I will say them every day for the rest of our lives," Edward said fervently. "If you will permit me to do so." Catherine turned to him, and in her grey eyes, those rain-cloud eyes he had finally learned to truly see, there was hope. Fragile, tentative hope, but hope, nonetheless. "The month is nearly over," she said quietly. "You promised me 1 month to prove you had changed." "And have I?" Edward asked, though he feared the answer. "Have I proven anything? Or have I simply made matters worse by showing you what might have been, if only I had not been so blind for so long?" Catherine was silent for a long moment, studying his face in the dimming light. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but soft. "You have proven that you are capable of change, that you can listen, learn, see what you previously overlooked. You have given me these past weeks in a way you never gave me the 3 years before them." "But," Edward prompted, hearing the unspoken word. "But I am still afraid," Catherine admitted. "Afraid that this is temporary, that once the novelty fades, once you feel you have done enough to assuage your guilt, you will revert to the man you were before. I have learned not to trust hope, Edward, and unlearning that lesson is proving more difficult than I anticipated." Edward felt something crack in his chest. He had done this to her. He had taught her that hoping for his attention, his affection, was foolish. And now, when he most desperately wanted her to hope, she could not. "I cannot promise you perfection," he said quietly. "I cannot promise that I will never disappoint you, never fall short of what you deserve. But I can promise you this, I will not stop trying. This is not temporary, Catherine. This is not guilt or novelty or some passing fancy. I have finally seen you, truly seen you, and I cannot unsee you now. I will not unsee you now." "How can you be certain?" Catherine asked, and there was such vulnerability in her voice that Edward wanted to gather her into his arms and promise her everything would be well, but he restrained, himself knowing that actions would speak more loudly than any embrace. "Because before I was content," Edward said simply. "I believed my life was exactly as it should be. I saw no reason to change, no need to look beyond the surface of things. But now I am not content. Now I lie awake at night thinking about conversations we might have, questions I want to ask you, aspects of your character I have only begun to discover. Now, the thought of returning to that previous existence, of once again, treating you as mere background to my life is unbearable. Not because I fear your departure, though I do fear that, but because I would be diminishing myself as much as you, because I have discovered that knowing you, truly knowing you, has made me more than I was." Catherine's tears were flowing freely now. "I want to believe you. I want to trust that this is real." "Then let me prove it," Edward said. "Not for 1 month, but for a year, for 10 years, for however long it takes for you to trust. that this is not a performance but a genuine transformation. I will court you as I should have done before we married. I will learn everything about you that I failed to learn before, and I will show you, through every day we have together, that you are seen, valued, cherished. Cherished, Catherine repeated, as though testing the word. That is a strong word, Edward. It is the only word adequate to what I feel, Edward said, and realized as he spoke that it was true. Somewhere during these weeks of learning to know Catherine, of discovering the woman he had married but never bothered to meet, he had moved beyond guilt and good intentions into something that felt remarkably like love. The realization stunned him. His father had warned him against this very thing, had told him that love was a dangerous delusion that led only to unhappiness. But Edward found he did not care. If this was delusion, it was a delusion he welcomed. If this was danger, it was danger he embraced. Willingly. Catherine, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I know I have no right to your affection. I know I have forfeited any claim to your love through 3 years of systematic neglect. But I must tell you, before we go any further, that I believe I have come to... He faltered, the words catching in his throat. How did one say such a thing? How did one admit to feelings that contradicted every principle one had built one's life upon? Catherine reached out slowly and took his hand, the first time she had voluntarily touched him since their disastrous encounter at Rothbury Park. Her fingers were cool, delicate, trembling slightly. You can say it, she whispered. Whatever it is, I will not mock you for it. I love you, Edward said, and the words came out choked but clear. I have fallen in love with my own wife, and I am profoundly grateful for the opportunity to do so, even if it comes 3 years too late. Catherine's breath caught. For a long moment she said nothing, simply staring at him with wide, shocked eyes. Then slowly she began to cry in earnest, great, shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Catherine, I'm sorry, I should not have... Edward began, alarmed. No, Catherine managed through her tears. No, don't apologize, I never thought... I had given up hope of ever hearing those words from you. Then I will say them again, Edward said fiercely. I will say them every day. I love you, Catherine. I love your quietness and your thoughtfulness, and your grey eyes that I was too blind to see. I love the way you rescue beetles in the garden and read novels in the morning room and manage the household with such subtle efficiency that I never noticed the 1,000 small ways you made my life easier. I love that you have survived 3 years of my neglect and still possess the courage to hope. I love everything about you, and I am asking, begging, for the chance to spend the rest of my life proving it. Catherine was shaking now, her tears coming harder. Edward, unable to restrain himself any longer, pulled her gently into his arms. She came willingly, burying her face against his chest as she wept. I don't know if I can say it back, she choked out. Not yet, I want to, but I'm so afraid. Then don't, Edward said, holding her carefully, as though she might break. Don't say anything you're not ready to say. Just allow me to stay. Allow me to continue, as we have been these past weeks. That is enough. You are enough exactly as you are. They sat like that in the garden as darkness fell around them, Catherine crying against Edward's chest, Edward holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. Which, he realized, she was. To him at least, she was everything. Finally, Catherine's tears subsided. She pulled back slightly, wiping at her face with the back of her hand in a gesture so unguarded, so unlike the composed viscountess she usually presented to the world, that Edward felt his heart clench. I want to try, she said quietly. I want to believe that this is real, that you mean what you say. But Edward, you must understand. If you disappoint me again, if this proves to be temporary, I will not survive it. I have survived 3 years by not hoping for more. If you give me hope again and then take it away, I will not, Edward promised solemnly. I swear to you, Catherine, on everything I hold sacred, I will not take it away. This is not temporary. This is who I am now, who I wish to remain for the rest of our lives together. Catherine searched his face, and Edward bore her scrutiny unflinchingly, willing her to see the truth in his words. We should return to the house, she said finally. "Mama will wonder where we've gone." "In a moment," Edward said. Then slowly, giving her every opportunity to refuse, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Catherine's breath hitched, but she did not pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes and leaned into him, just for a moment, before drawing back and rising from the bench. "Come," she said, extending her hand to him, "before my mother sends someone to look for us." Edward took her hand and stood, and they walked back to the house together through the gathering darkness. The journey back to Hertfordshire the following day was quiet, but it was a different quality of silence than before, less tense, more contemplative. Edward found himself acutely conscious of Catherine beside him, of the small space between them on the carriage seat, of the way her hand rested on the cushion, close enough to his own that he could have taken it if he dared. He did not dare, not yet. He had made his confession. Now he must prove its truth through sustained action, not through presumptuous gestures of affection. When they arrived at Ashford House, it was early evening. The servants were assembled in the entrance hall to greet them, as was proper. But Edward noticed something he had never noticed before, the way the staff's faces brightened when they saw Catherine, the genuine warmth in their greetings to her. They loved her, he realized. The people who worked in his house, who saw her daily, who had observed her kindness and consideration for 3 years, they loved her in a way he had been too blind to see. He had been surrounded by evidence of Catherine's worth, and he had noticed none of it. After they had supervised the unpacking of their luggage and taken tea in the drawing room, Catherine rose to retire to her rooms. Edward stood as well, intercepting her before she could reach the door. "Catherine," he said quietly, "might I ask you something?" She turned, her expression cautious but not closed. "Of course. Would you—" Edward hesitated, then pushed forward. "Would you consider having dinner with me tonight? Not as a duty, not because propriety requires it, but because I would very much enjoy your company." Something softened in Catherine's face. "I would like that," she said quietly. That evening, Edward instructed the servants to set the table more intimately than usual, not at opposite ends of the long dining table, but close together, near enough to converse easily. He had cook prepare the dishes Catherine preferred, based on the careful attention he had been paying to her choices over the past weeks. When Catherine entered the dining room and saw the arrangements, she paused, surprise evident on her face. "I thought," Edward said, suddenly uncertain, "that we might dine as partners rather than strangers. But if you prefer the usual arrangement—" "No," Catherine interrupted softly. This is lovely, Edward." The meal passed in genuine conversation, about Catherine's mother's health, about the estate matters that required attention, about the book Edward had just finished reading, Sense and Sensibility, also by Miss Austen, which he had found equally insightful. Catherine gradually relaxed, the careful guardedness she usually maintained easing as the evening progressed. "I have been thinking," Edward said as dessert was being cleared, "about your suggestion for the herb garden. I spoke with the head gardener before we left for Kent, and he is prepared to begin work immediately upon your instruction. I thought perhaps we might walk there tomorrow morning, and you could show him precisely where you wish it to be situated." Catherine looked at him with something that might have been wonder. "You truly spoke with the gardener about my idea?" "Of course. It was an excellent idea. Why should you not have a herb garden if you wish it?" "I suppose I have spent so long assuming my wishes were unimportant that I find it difficult to believe when someone actually listens to them," Catherine said quietly. Edward felt the familiar ache of guilt, but pushed it aside. Guilt would not help Catherine. Only consistent demonstration of change would accomplish that. "Your wishes are important to me," he said simply. "I hope in time you will come to believe that." After dinner, they retired to the drawing room together, another departure from their usual custom, in which Catherine would excuse herself and Edward would remain alone with his brandy and his papers. Instead, Edward poured himself a modest glass of brandy, Catherine requested tea, and they settled into chairs near the fireplace. "Would you read to me?" Edward asked impulsively. "You read to your mother while we were in Kent. I found your voice quite soothing." Catherine's eyes widened. "You wish me to read aloud to you, if it would not bore you? I thought perhaps we might begin Mansfield Park. I understand it is another of Miss Austen's works. It is, Catherine confirmed, still looking somewhat stunned. Though it is longer than the others. It would take several evenings to complete. Then we shall make a ritual of it, Edward said. Each evening, if you are willing. Catherine rose and retrieved the book from the shelves where she kept her small collection of favourites. She settled back into her chair, opened to the first page, and began to read. Edward watched her as she read, the way her lips formed the words, the slight rise and fall of her voice as she gave each character a subtly different tone, the animation that entered her face as the story progressed. He was not particularly attending to the story itself. He was attending to her, to the woman he had finally learned to see. This became their pattern. Each morning, they walked in the gardens together, discussing the day ahead, making plans for various improvements to the estate. Each afternoon, they attended to their separate pursuits, but came together for tea in the drawing room, sharing details of their activities. Each evening they dined together, and then Catherine would read aloud while Edward listened, occasionally commenting on the story but more often simply enjoying her presence. Weeks passed, then months. Summer faded into autumn, the gardens transforming into shades of gold and crimson. The herb garden Catherine had desired was planted and thriving. The rose garden had been expanded per her suggestions. Small changes appeared throughout the house, new cushions in colours Catherine preferred, paintings she had selected replacing ones she had never cared for, arrangements that reflected her taste rather than simply the taste of previous generations of Ashfords. And gradually, slowly, Catherine began to trust. Edward saw it in small ways, the way she would reach for his hand, unprompted during their morning walks, the manner in which she would share her thoughts without waiting to be asked, the increasing frequency of her smiles, genuine and unguarded when something amused her, the way she leaned into him slightly when they sat together in the evenings, a gesture so subtle she might not even be aware of it. They had not repeated the intimacy of their wedding night. Edward would not presume such a thing until Catherine gave some clear indication she would welcome it, but there was intimacy between them now of a different sort. The intimacy of two people learning to trust one another, to share their lives in ways that went beyond the merely physical. Winter came, bringing with it the Christmas season. Catherine's family was invited to spend the holidays at Ashford House, along with several other families from the neighbourhood. Edward watched his wife transform the house for the festivities, coordinating with Mrs. Holbrook to create an atmosphere of warmth and celebration. On Christmas Eve, after the other guests had retired for the evening, Edward and Catherine stood together in the drawing room, admiring the decorations by firelight. "This has been the happiest Christmas I can remember," Catherine said softly. "Thank you, Edward, for everything, for changing, for trying, for seeing me." Edward turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "It is I who should thank you, for giving me the chance to prove myself, for not giving up on us entirely when you had every reason to do so, for allowing me to fall in love with you." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears this time. Edward could see the difference. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I have been wanting to say it for some time now, but I was afraid. Afraid it was too soon, afraid I might be wrong, afraid of so many things. But I cannot keep it inside any longer." "What is it?" Edward asked gently, though his heart was pounding with something that felt very much like hope. "I love you," Catherine said, and the words were clear and strong despite her tears. "I have fallen in love with you, Edward. Not with the idea of you, not with your position or your name, but with you. The man who walks with me in the mornings and listens when I talk about gardens. The man who reads novels he has no interest in simply because I recommended them. The man who looks at me now as though I am the most important person in the world." Edward's breath caught. He had hoped for this, had worked toward it, but hearing the words still struck him with the force of a revelation. "Catherine," he whispered, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her close as she had held him that night in her mother's garden. "My Catherine, I promise you, we'll spend every day of the rest of our lives being worthy of those words." "You already are," Catherine said against his chest. "You already are." They stood there in the firelight, holding each other, and Edward felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness, of coming home, of having finally found what he had not known he was searching for. Later, as he lay in his own bed unable to sleep, Edward thought about his father's warnings against love, against sentiment, against allowing emotion to dictate behavior. His father had been wrong. Love was not weakness, sentiment was not delusion, and emotion, properly understood, did not cloud judgment. It clarified it, allowing one to see what truly mattered beyond the narrow confines of duty and propriety. Edward had built his life on principles that promised order, control, predictability, and he had achieved all of those things at the cost of everything that made life worth living. Catherine had forced him to see that. She had asked for her freedom, and in doing so had given him his freedom from the rigid constraints of his father's philosophy, freedom to feel and hope and love, freedom to be more than the cold, controlled man he had believed he was supposed to be. The next morning, Edward descended to breakfast to find Catherine already there, smiling at him with genuine warmth as he entered the room. She had stopped making herself invisible. She no longer moved through his house like a ghost. She was present, solid, real, and more beautiful for it than any woman he had ever seen. "Good morning, my love," he said, the endearment still new enough to feel slightly strange on his tongue, but entirely right nonetheless. "Good morning," Catherine replied, and her smile widened. "I thought perhaps after breakfast we might walk in the gardens. It snowed last night, and I believe it will be quite lovely." "I would like nothing better," Edward said, settling into the chair beside her, no longer across from her at a distance, but beside her, close enough to touch. As they ate breakfast together, discussing their plans for the day, Edward reflected on how profoundly his life had changed. 6 months ago, he had been a man living in careful isolation, believing himself content while slowly destroying the only person who had ever tried to reach him. Now, he was a man who walked in snowy gardens with his wife, who read novels by firelight, who knew what it felt like to be loved, and to love in return. Everyone had seen Catherine as the quiet wife, easily overlooked, unremarkable. They had all been wrong. She was extraordinary. And Edward had nearly lost her because he had been too blind to see what was directly in front of him. But he saw her now, and he would never stop seeing her, never stop appreciating her, never stop being grateful that she had given him the chance to become the husband she deserved. Outside, snow continued to fall softly over the gardens at Ashford House. Inside, Edward Ashford, Viscount Langley, sat beside his wife and understood finally what it meant to be truly married. Not the joining of properties and titles and social positions, but the joining of two souls who had learned, slowly and painfully and beautifully, to see one another at last.